1 billion. Why? 1 billion. Why is this happening in Minnesota? Um, I know the knee-jerk response from people who live here. I'm a Minnesotan myself. My name is Brandon Fertig. I'm a human interest writer and do some social analysis. And since I'm a Minnesotan, I take a special interest in what happens in my state. I was born and raised here, live here still. And I know the knee-jerk reaction is to you're going to either blame the people under whose watch all of this fraud happened, all the many cases of fraud that have added up to potentially $1 billion, hundreds of millions of dollars stolen, some retrieved. And two, you'll blame the people who committed the fraud, naturally. But the name of this account and the name of my YouTube channel and my email is The Periphery, because I like to look at issues from that which is kind of on the side that we miss. And so I look at this in a more systemic manner, and I'm going to present that case for you right now as to why Minnesota is exploited, is victimized for this and other reasons in this day and age. Last fall, I wrote a piece for the Star Tribune that asked, is Minnesota in trouble? And the hypothesis for why I think Minnesota is in some trouble is the reason why I think this fraud is happening. I actually think this comes down to science, personality science. That might sound a little fuzzy-wuzzy, but in the realm of psychology, one of the best replicated findings there is the big five personality traits. And one of those traits is openness. And Minnesota, as well as the neighboring states, score among the lowest in the country. They all score quite low because we're all, from that Scandinavian, Northern European stock. And it's that reserved, it's that Minnesota nice where you're extroverted. And in fact, this region scores high in extroversion too. And yet there's a non-confrontationalness. There's a conflict avoidance. And that's why this particular study took the results of the Big Five across the country, and they found that there were three clusters of general personality regions in the U.S. And the upper Midwest and upper Midwest specifically scored very high in this one cluster called friendly and conventional. So we're very extroverted, we're very welcoming, but we're not very open ultimately when it comes to things that are like different ways of doing things, getting close to people, dealing with conflict, things like that. Here's another article that is about outgoingness and extroversion. And they had North Dakota the most outgoing state, but you can see Minnesota is almost just, must score right next to it. And look at the upper Midwest. So you see the cluster, and so I think these cultural clusters are very meaningful. But whereas Minnesota is like its neighbors in terms of that difficulty with conflict and confrontation and really connecting with people, we do separate ourselves in one other area. So we stand out from the rest, and that's with politics and ideology. Minnesotans in general, there's a ton of exceptions to this, greater Minnesota being very different than the metro area. But in general, Minnesota is a bluish state. And So a lot of Minnesotans take pride in that. They take pride in the DFL, the local Democratic Party. They take pride in being welcoming, progressive. And you drive around Minneapolis, you see a lot of people with those yard signs. Love is love. We believe in science. All are welcome here. That kind of thing. Minnesota prides itself on that. The issue is that puts Minnesota in a challenging spot with how its ideology is facing these modern times, because we are welcoming, and there are more people now to welcome, because borders are up until Trump they were quite porous, and it's just a more fluid time, whether we're talking people, whether we're talking ideas, and so you might be eager to welcome in all of this, but the challenge is that the more you invite in, the more there'll be heads butting. Another indicator of this is homelessness. just to kind of broaden the scope of the theory into another realm of this matter, which I've also covered on this channel. But this is the number of homeless according to Wikipedia, and Minnesota has actually recorded different numbers than this, but I think the general like ratios of the numbers remain the same. And whether it's the Minnesota count or whether it's this one on Wikipedia, the truth remains that Minnesota actually has a few. It's close, but we actually have fewer people than Wisconsin, and yet we have not double, but like 40% or like almost double what Wisconsin has in homeless. And so I think this is another example of how, whether it's with fraud or whether it's with the homeless situation, you have the same phenomenon where we're very welcoming. We want to be helpful. We don't want to, confront problems, and so we'll let, say, an encampment go. And now they're a lot more strict than they were in past years, I understand. But generally, there's a more liberal approach to homelessness, to crime, and in the case of this piece or this video, to fraud. This might be a cheap shot to the governor, but it's such a good illustration of this problem. So here's our governor in 2021 congratulating this woman with a what was she receiving? Outstanding Refugee Award. Well, she is one of the defendants in the Feeding Our Future fraud that stole $250 million from taxpayers. And I believe the fraud was going on precisely when this award was given. So as she was stealing from Minnesota taxpayers, or at least involved in the theft, she was receiving an award from our governor for being outstanding. There was even a Somali writer here who said, look, and this is about a year ago, he said, hey, there's a lot of fraud in my community. Here's what we need to do about it in Minnesota. And he asks the regulators to be stricter on his community, that he says, look, we come from a culture that, there's more corruption where we come from. And so we come here and, if you don't police the community, that tendency might resurface as it seems it has. So now where are we at today? We're playing catch up, right? Like, this is just from a few days ago. And Walz is like, hey, look, I've stopped payments to 50 of the largest housing stabilization providers. This was just one of the scams as part of that billion. He's saying, hey, we're putting people in jail who committed this fraud. But I think this is all Band-Aid stuff. What Minnesota needs to do is recognize that we have a cultural kind of handicap when it comes to addressing these conflicting, fluid times that we're in with the internet, with this more, unwieldy world. And Minnesota is not really made for it very well. We were made for a previous time. So if we want to excel in the future, we need to find leadership that can embrace this conflicting time better than we tend to be able to on our own.